based on the ISO which you've set. Your light meters will help you assess the quality of light and to create a proper exposure for that light onto your image. One thing to know about all light meters: doesn't matter what kind of light meter it is, through the lens meter, a handheld meter, through the lens is what most DSLRs use. A handheld light meter is a light meter supplemental to your camera. Doesn't matter if it's reflective or incident. Your camera sees reflective light. An incident light meter measures the actual amount of light that falls on an object. But all light meters, whatever they measure, average that amount of light. They average what they measure to create perfect middle gray. Perfect middle gray is exactly halfway between black and white. All light meters read in perfect middle gray. The 4 controls for exposure start with ISO. That's one of the presets for your camera. Adjust the sensitivity of the camera to light by your ISO. In brighter situations, you can use a lower ISO number. In lower light situations, you need to use a higher ISO number. In addition to that, controlling your exposure is your aperture or your f-stop, the iris in your camera, and the shutter, the amount of time that you allow light to strike the sensor. Add to that the light intensity of the scene that you photograph. Those are the 4 areas that control exposure: ISO, your aperture, your shutter, and the intensity of the light. Always, before you go out and shoot, set your ISO, select your mode, whether it's manual, time, or shutter speed preferred. To activate your light meter, most cameras allow you to depress the shutter release button halfway to get a light meter reading. These are reminders. The ISO is going to depend on where and what you're photographing. Generally speaking, the higher the ISO number, the more noise. The ISO number, the more sensitive your sensor is to light, meaning you can photograph in lower light situations. I've highlighted 400. 400 is a good starting point if you're photographing either outdoors during daylight hours or indoors in a brightly lit room. Or a more modestly lit room, you might bump that up to 800 or something in between. Notice the full f-stops that I have listed. Again, most electronic shutters, parts of digital cameras, have 1/3 and 1/2 f-stops in between. Some have 1/10 f-stops in between these. But get used to these numbers because these are all full f-stops. And again, the correlation between shutter speeds and f-stops, and you see the shutter speeds there below, is they each let in 1/2 or twice amount the light as its neighboring f-stop or shutter speed. So if my camera indicated to me an exposure of 1/60th of a second at f11, but what I'm photographing, I want to use a little faster shutter speed. I want to use 1/125th of a second. Rather than f11, I would open up to f8 since I'm closing down in the shutter. I'm using less light in the shutter, so I compensate by giving more light with the f-stop or vice versa. That unique relationship between shutter speeds and f-stops is the most important feature in your camera. Notice with the shutter speeds here, I've highlighted 1/60th of a second and those shutter speeds that are faster. For hand holding most cameras, those are the shutter speeds that you want to limit yourself to if you're wanting sharp, defined results. Other parts of your presets for your camera is your white balance. And my suggestion, set it to auto white balance or average white balance, AWB. The quality or the mode of your settings, the quality or mode of your camera, RAW, RAW is what you should shoot in if you have that option. Otherwise, you should use the largest file size that your camera allows. The different exposure modes are listed here. Manual, where you set the shutter speed and f-stop. Automatic, you can use, but frankly, automatic exposure modes, you cede or give control to the camera in ways that you really don't need to. Automatic exposure modes work most of the time, at least half the time, but the other times they don't give you the results that you're hoping for. You certainly can use aperture preferred, where you set the aperture, where you set the f-stop, and the camera adjusts the shutter speed. Or what I would suggest is you're starting out, shutter speed preferred, S or TV on some cameras. And shutter preferred mode allows you to select a shutter speed. So again, if you're hand holding your camera, usually 1/60th of a second or anything faster, any higher number. And the camera light meter selects the f-stop. Programmed, again, if you understand your camera, you can use it on the program mode, but you have to program it in a way that benefits you. So the ones I'm going to suggest are manual or aperture or shutter speed preferred. I mentioned it before, but reflective light is what your camera sees. The amount of light that reflects off of objects is what the camera and our eye sees. Incident light meters record the amount of light that actually strikes an object. The two can be different. Let's say it's an object painted a flat black color. There might be a lot of light striking the object, but less light reflecting from the object. But if reflected light is what your camera sees, it's a benefit, generally speaking, to meter and reflective light. Again, light meters always average what they record as perfect middle gray. Doesn't matter if it's an averaging light meter that averages all the light of the entire image, or a spot meter that usually takes a 15-degree angle in the center and measures the light just of that. Whatever meter reading the light meter is making, it's averaging the light of that particular thing to equal perfect middle gray, halfway between black and white. Well, there's a couple different ways of using the information of the light meter, and that's simply to trust the light meter to always be working, that everything that you photograph can average together to give you a proper exposure. There's some truth to that, but there's some times that doesn't work as well. It's about a 50-50 shot. Another way is using what's called an 18% gray card. A gray card is a gray piece of board that is halfway between black and white. If your light meter reads a scene and averages it to create perfect middle gray, if you put that gray card in the scene that you're going to photograph at the angle you're going to photograph and fill the frame of your viewfinder with that gray card, you're taking a meter reading of something gray and assigning it essentially the f-stop and shutter speed that would create that gray tone. I don't know about you, but I don't love carrying a gray piece of cardboard everywhere I photograph. And though it's a successful method, regardless of the quality of light, it's kind of a nuisance. There's another method that basically the catchphrase is expose for the shadows, where you take a meter reading of the darkest shadow detail that you want to include in your photograph. And again, your light meter reads that as what would be perfect middle gray. Well, as a shadow, you probably don't want it middle gray. You want it a dark gray or a light black. So instead of accepting what your camera gives you, and so let's just say that it tells you a 60th of a second at f8 when you meter that shadow detail of your picture, a 60th at f8. And essentially what you can do is take that 1/60th at f8 and say, well, thanks, light meter, you got me here, but I don't want that shadow to be a middle gray. I want it to be a light black. So what I'm going to do is take that 1/60th at f8, stop down from f8 to f11 to f16. So I would use it 1/60th of a second at f16. What I've essentially done is taken that middle gray shadow. By stopping it down once, I've made it dark gray. By stopping it down a second time, I've made it light black. So taking a meter reading of just that detail, then stopping down 2 stops, essentially I'll get a perfect exposure every time. Again, you have to think about it a little bit. I want to show you some sample DSLR menus where you can see the information. So let's look at the top here. The shutter speed is set at 1/4000th of a second. Their f-stop, their aperture at f5.6. That's a fast shutter speed. And this light meter display here, generally some cameras display it one way or another, but generally what holds true, if this hash mark is towards the left, towards the minus numbers, it's telling you there's not enough light there, that you need to adjust shutter speed or f-stop. Or if it's to the right in the plus sign there, what it's telling you is that there's too much light, and the 1 and the 2 means 1 stop underexposed, 2 stops underexposed, or 1 stop over, or 2 stops overexposed. So that basically you can adjust this line, whether it's to the left or the right, by adjusting shutter speed or f-stop up or down according to what you need. Also, as part of this display, you can see it. You've set the ISO here at 100. They're using auto or average white balance. They're shooting in RAW. And in this case, they're shooting in a program mode, which is one that I'm not going to suggest to you at this point. But start to understand that this is something that you can control, that you want it to come across the hash mark at 0, or if there's another little hash mark. But that's where your ideal exposure is based on what you filled your light meter with. Another example, this time on a point and shoot. So again, ISO, this time 50, the quality is fine. That's probably pretty good for a point and shoot camera. The f-stop and the shutter speed, 1 second at f6.2. They're shooting in the manual exposure mode, so they can select their own shutter speed and f-stop. And here's, again, the light meter scale. And so notice all the little boxes here. What you want is just the center box to light up. That's going to tell you that for that scene, averaging all the light and dark tones there together, when you do that and get that just lit up in the center, it's telling you that's what it thinks is a perfect exposure. When there's more lights to the left, that's telling you that the picture is a little bit underexposed. It's going to be a little bit dark. If the lights were more to the right, it would be telling you where it was overexposed. Well, in this sample, you can kind of see the picture is a little bit dark, and the light meter is indicating that. And so this person could adjust the shutter speed, make it 2 seconds, or maybe they would take the f6.2 and drop that down to f5.6 or f4 or something like that to let more light through to get this centered. But from brand to brand, manufacturer to manufacturer, the light meter scale display may be slightly different. Sometimes you're seeing it through the viewfinder of the camera, sometimes in the LCD screen, but they all work basically the same way. 2 similar examples by Ansel Adams, but here's where your average light meter is going to work half the time, but not quite work exactly the other half of the time. In this Ansel Adams photograph, you can see that about half of the image is pretty light in tone. And the other half, you took the top part and that part, are dark. You have about an equal amount of light and dark tones. With my averaging light meter, just looking through and measuring the light of this entire scene, I can probably trust that to be fairly accurate because the scene I'm photographing is largely half light and half dark. This is a slightly different case on the right here, where I really have one little sliver of light tones and some other in the sky that are slightly light, but even those are more like a middle gray value. Other than that, the bottom third of the photograph is really just dark, as is the top third of the photograph, and then I have some middle values and just a little bit of lightness. If I use my averaging light meter here together, I don't have an even amount of dark and light tones in the scene I'm photographing. So my light meter here is likely to fool me. It's likely to give me an exposure where I have my dark tones is almost a darkish middle gray rather than almost black. So here's a scene again where rather than just trusting my averaging light meter, if I filled the frame of my light meter with a dark detail, I walked up to something or changed my angle of view a little bit so that I just filled the frame of part of the dark detail, took a light meter reading of that, would tell me how to expose that to get middle gray. I would say, thank you very much. I don't want that dark detail middle gray. I want it light black. So what I'm going to do is stop down 2 stops, 1 stop to take that middle gray to dark gray, the second stop from dark gray to light black. Black like the one that you see here, which would have some detail. So to me, those are your 2 best options of trusting the averaging light meter or being able to simply take a light meter reading of the shadow detail and stop down 2 stops. I covered this briefly on an earlier lecture, but histograms can be useful with exposures. Understanding the histogram, it's a map of the tonal values in your particular photograph. Your camera creates a histogram for each one of your photographs. When you add 0 as a digit to 255, between 0, which is black, and 255, which is white, you have 256 shades of gray in each of the channels of your color image, a red, green, and blue channel. Understanding the histogram, what you're seeing here is that you have very few absolute blacks. You have a lot of dark blacks and even more dark grays to middle gray, which you see in the middle there. A lot of light grays. And then the steep angle here shows you have very few just blank bright whites. That's the map of this particular image. Well, when you're making a photograph, you can judge the exposure by your histogram. And you can see in this image, it's kind of a silhouette of some people along the cliff of a mountain there. And you can see there's a lot of darks and a lot of highlights. Not so many middle values in this photograph, and you can see that represented here. Well, again, with your histogram, if everything was pushed over to the right, that's going to tell you there's too much light there, that you need to cut the shutter speed or the f-stop. Or if it's all pushed to the left, or if it's all pushed here to the left, that's going to tell you that it's underexposed and you need to open up either shutter speed or f-stop, or increase your ISO, but those are your variables. I wanted to tell you there's some useful tools that you can find on your phone as well. This is an app that I've been using. I don't know if it's still free. I got it when it was free, called My Light Meter. There's several others that compete with it now. I find this very easy to use. It allows you to set your ISO and then you measure the light based on an image that you see in here, and it's going to tell you based on that ISO and averaging the light that you see coming through the light meter in the picture, it's going to tell you what your f-stop and shutter speed is. Once you know one combination of shutter speeds and f-stop, if you close one down, you open the other one up and vice versa. and you have a whole bunch of different options that all have the same amount of light that strike your meter and create your image, but the characteristics of that image, either with a shallow or great depth of field or with a fast or slow shutter speed.